Well, folks, we're now less than 3 months away from the end of the War Within expansion, which any old hand at gold making will be able to tell you is the absolute worst time to try to make any gold. Or at least that's normally what happens. I have seen my gold per hour rates dip since around the time when Turbo Boost launched for sure. So far, so normal. But this expansion has been anything but normal for gold making, and that has meant that the dip is also looking very, very different from my experience of past expansions. So I thought I'd do a little update on my personal experience of casual farm-based gold making in the War Within. Now, before I take a look at how the expansion has played out, it is worth running through my personal approach to gold making, as different approaches will have had very different experiences. It is the nature of gold making for there to be winners and losers. I'm personally not a fan of crafting. Running back and forth between the auction house, vendors and crafting tables is pretty boring for me, as is babysitting the auction house. On top of that, thanks to the elements of RNG in the new crafting system, it's next to impossible now to work out if a craft is actually profitable without using tools like Craft Sim. That's not to say that I don't touch crafting at all. This expansion I did level up a blacksmith, tailor and jewel crafter, but that was really just to enable me to be self-sufficient for gear crafting, as I really don't find the crafting order system to be at all customer friendly. And I have to say that after also investing in enchanting, only to have the enchanted crest taken away, well, that wasn't exactly an incentive for me to start taking crafting any more seriously. Given that, you probably also won't be surprised to hear that auction house flipping really isn't for me either. These days, to succeed at that particular version of the game requires running massive inventory and therefore massive risk, or just babysitting the auction house to cancel scan at will. That of course leaves us with farming. There are a bunch of different approaches to farming, of course, including raw gold farming or group farming, but ever since I started gold making back in Battle for Azeroth, my long-term standby has been materials farming, primarily through herbing and mining. Now, for sure, it's the case that herbing and mining really isn't the most time efficient of approaches, and there have been times when hitting even 10k gold per hour has been a challenge. But I've never been about min-maxing, and farming is generally a good way to have some chill downtime in the game. And it is also very low risk, requiring no upfront gold outlay, and even older content farms for the most part do sell pretty reliably, meaning that the only thought that is required is choosing what and where to farm. Now, before this expansion even launched, during the pre-patch, we saw the introduction of a major new goldsink. The Warband Bank, of course, has been a massive benefit for gold makers across the board. But if you want to maximise your Warbank capacity, and what gold maker doesn't, that final tab costs you 2.5 million gold. I'm pretty sure that that decision by the developers was very much a case of Blizzard knowing their market, as very few players outside of serious gold makers actually need more than 2 or 3 Warbank tabs. But it did mean that for some of us gold makers, we were starting the new expansion in negative territory. As a farmer, the Warband Bank really isn't quite so important. I'm generally not shifting lots of inventory cross-realm, so I personally chose to wait and only purchase the tabs as I made the gold in Midnight to afford them. Although I have to admit that I am putting afford in inverted commas here, as I went into the new expansion with around 20 million liquid gold. Now, when a new expansion starts up, my approach is to rotate through the new zones, doing a few full sweeps to get a handle on routing, and a good idea of herbing and mining yields. As with previous expansions, there was a lot of variation between the zones, and for me, Ash Kahet very quickly emerged as a key frontrunner. Unlike pre-Dragonflight expansions, where the first week or so tends to go absolutely gangbustered, followed by a very sharp drop in gold, the new profession system's relatively slow and gated approach to fully scaling up means that those early days are fairly decent, averaging around 15 to 17,000 gold per hour. But the early drop in prices was more than offset with increasing yields, as I fully unlocked all of the sources of initial skills. and of course got those first couple of weeks of skill points as well. And this is where things in the War Within started to diverge from my previous experience in Dragonflight. In that particular expansion, I started out making around 15 to 17,000 gold per hour and found that it flatlined for several weeks as falling prices were being offset by increasing yields thanks to the process of skilling up. In marked contrast, in the War Within, by the time the raid opened up, I was easily hitting 24 to 25k per hour, rates which for my personal chilled approach to gold farming, honestly, is quite unprecedented. Of course, such levels are not likely to last, so it was very much a case of making some hay while the sun shined. Now, the War Bank wasn't the only gold sink that we got in the War Within though. Engineers also got a brand new mount to make, the Crowd Pummeler, but this one was a little bit unusual. The materials to make it could be obtained in two different ways. One of those ways was to outright buy the materials from a vendor at the cost of around 3.5 million gold in total, which means of course that we had a second gold sink on our hands. The other way was through a system called pilfering, where engineers could break down other materials for parts, including a chance at getting some of those precious mount parts. And we weren't limited to just current content mats either, with a bunch of older content materials being relevant for the process as well. The end result of that at the start of expansion was that a bunch of older content mining farms suddenly became quite valuable. For example, mithril ore, jumping from around 7,500 gold per hour to 15,000 plus, and this did help to offset the cost of the mount quite a bit, as very early on one could start to buy the parts for the mount on the auction house for substantially less gold than the vendor. Now, I did originally do a video guide for getting the new mount, and the TLDR of it is that I personally did some scrapping but found it to still be quite a bit expensive, albeit I did get lucky and get the most expensive part for around half its normal price that way, and that meant that I ended up getting the rest of the parts on the auction house, bringing the overall cost of the mount for me down to around 1.8 million gold, which was still a pretty penny. But anyway, after that little diversion, let's get back to Season 1 and take a look at how it played out overall. My expectation was for my current content farming to very quickly drop below the 20,000 gold mark, down closer to maybe 12 to 13,000 gold per hour, but I was wrong. Instead, prices stayed stubbornly just above 20 to 21,000 gold, and that lasted well past the halfway point of the first season. And it was a very pleasant surprise to get, especially as I was needing to make around 4 million gold for all of those gold sinks just to hit the break-even point. And you never know, of course, what else Blizzard might drop on us to try to prize even more of our gold reserves out of us. Eventually, in the second half of the season, prices did start to drop, but only to around the 17,000 gold per hour mark. Now, to put that in perspective, in Dragonflight, I had considered 15,000 gold per hour to be the threshold for a very good day at the start of that expansion. And seeing levels much higher than that so late in the season did make me start to wonder what has changed. One major factor was a change to how frequently higher ranked herbs and orbs could be mined. In Dragonflight, as we gained skill points, the ratio of rank 1 to rank 3 materials became very heavily weighted towards rank 3. But in the War Within, while we still get more rank 3s as we leveled up, the volumes were quite a bit lower than in Dragonflight. And of course, lower supply does inevitably lead to those higher prices. And for sure, that was part of the reason those prices held up, but it was still very surprising to me, as those higher prices were leading to higher cost crafting, and you would have expected supply and demand on the crafting side to also adjust. But no matter what the reason, I think my absolutely worst day in the War Within was around 15,000 gold per hour, and that was very much an outlier. And as the season came to an end, I started to notice that prices were climbing again, very heavily back up to above that 20,000 gold per hour mark. Now, before I wrap up with Season 1, there is worth giving a bit of an honourable mention for delve materials. Delve dropped some very unique materials, most notably the profane tinderbox, and very constrained supply meant very high prices, prices which remained high even after significant buffs and drop rates from Blizzard. And later on in the season, as we ran out of other stuff to spend Undercoin on, people did start purchasing Delve material bags from the vendor, but even that didn't really seem to dent prices very much. I have a feeling that the Undercoin Delve material bags were a little bit of a sleeper in Season 1, with not all that many people knowing that you could make some very serious gold from Undercoin. But for those of us who did know, it was a very, very nice bonus. And thanks to all of that, despite dropping around 4.5 million gold on Goldsinks in Season 1, I managed to end the season with 22.6 million gold, meaning that I was up 2.6 million. Now, Season 2 started very strongly indeed, back up to around 21 to 22,000 gold per hour. Now, I will say that a spike in prices at the start of Season 2 back to the expansion launch levels isn't that uncommon, as the big guilds strip mine the auction house for materials at a time when we're still not fully maxed out on our professions. But that spike is normally very short-lived, maybe just a week or most. Now, if you've been paying attention, you probably know what I'm about to say. Just as with Season 1, prices instead remained very stubbornly high for a very long time, meaning that even as us farmers started to max out our professions and thus yields were approaching their peaks, we were still making bank on a scale that I haven't seen for many, many expansions. But surely this couldn't last. But last it did. In fact, prices remained well above 20,000 gold per hour for much longer than was the case in even Season 1. Part of the reason for that, of course, is those higher yields from the higher skilled professions. But those higher yields also mean higher supply, and that should have meant the prices were decreasing. And as it happens, those price decreases were seen when it came to Delve mats, as I think that a lot more people did find out about those Undercoin bags. And I also have a suspicion that Blizzard made some very quiet additional buffs to Delve drop rates to try to address increasing player complaints about the relatively unaffordable cost of their enchants. But it was around this time that I think that I started to really notice that for herbing and mining, the stability of the prices was starting to very significantly deviate from anything that I'd seen in past expansions. Normally in Season 2, after that initial spike in prices would tend to drop and keep dropping and drop again. In Dragonflight Season 2, by around a third of the way into the second season, my gold per hour had already tanked to below 10,000. But at the same time in the War Within, I was still making well above 20,000 gold per hour. So something was seriously going on here, and I have a theory about what it is. If you ever farmed glow spurs in Zaralek Caverns midway through patch 10.10, you will likely recall those armies of dragon riding players swooping down in every single node on the map to instantly pick it dry. Players whose mastery of dragon riding was improbably precise. In contrast, in Ashkahet, or indeed the Isle of Dorn, which was starting to emerge as a frequent competitor for the top farming zone, the only competition I would ever see would be the occasional lone player sharing the same nodes as me. And this, I think, was the key. Something had indeed changed. Now, maybe it was simply just a sharding change, leaving fewer farmers per shard and thus lower competition, making it easier for us to keep our yields up. But back in Dragonflight, I think that the majority of legitimate farmers had some very strong suspicions that their primary competition was bots. And in the War Within, with bot-like activity being nowhere to be seen in my farms, you know, that might just explain why prices were staying so stubbornly high. The big issue with farm bots for legitimate farmers, of course, is that they oversupply our markets and cause prices to crater, just as did happen in Dragonflight Season 2. Take those bots out of the equation and supply will, no matter what, be substantially lower. And low supply, of course, means much higher prices. There is no way for a player like me to be sure, but I have, over the course of the War Within, formed a very strong suspicion that Blizzard have been having a lot more success, or perhaps just been putting a lot more effort into dealing with bots. And even if you're not a farmer, you just have to look at the cost of weapon enchants to see the effects of that low supply in action. Now, in the latter half of Season 2, prices did eventually start to sink down back to that 17,000 gold per hour mark. And near the end of the season, they went down again to around 15,000 gold per hour, at which time I was spending a lot more time in the Isle of Dorn than I was in Ash-Kahet, as its herd mix did seem to be holding up a lot better. And then, just as with Season 1, we saw another end of season surge in prices. This time, not as good as it was at the end of Season 1, but they did still go up to around 17 to 18,000 gold per hour. And keeping in mind that at the same time in Dragonflight, I was struggling to even hit 10,000 gold per hour, that was still a very nice boost. And with no new gold sinks to be seen anywhere, that allowed me to take my gold levels up to 27.6 million gold, meaning that I am plus 7.6 million on the start of the War Within. Now, surely, with Season 3 being the final season, these excellent prices just couldn't continue. And this time, sadly, I was right. But not right away. The first few weeks of the season were, thanks to those Race to World First Guild, pretty stable. But a few weeks in, we did start to see prices sinking. But even then, that sink didn't go all that far. For the bulk of the first half of Season 3, I've been seeing around 15 to 16,000 gold per hour, which was double what I could make in Dragonflight at the same time in that expansion. There were a few false starts where prices would sink for a few days. I think I saw it drop one day down as low as 12,000 gold per hour, but quite often those prices very quickly recovered. And around Turbo Boost, there was yet another short-lived increase in prices. After that final bump though, the dips in prices did start to become a lot more frequent and a lot more sustained. And as of now, late in Season 3, I am seeing farming values hovering around the 10,000 gold per hour mark, but that's still around the normal average for a Season 1 in most expansions, not the final expansion season. Now, usually as expansions go on, I tend to eventually start to swap to older content farms, which tend to be a lot more stable price-wise, as there are a lot less people doing them. Normally that process kicks in midway through Season 2, but this time it was a whole season later before I saw any point to make the switch to those older content areas. And when I did switch, a large part of that was due to those older farms' prices spiking up in value. While I personally had no real reason to go after older content farms earlier in the expansion, I had been keeping an eye on their prices. And it was not just the current expansion farms which had been seeing better prices overall. Whatever had changed was clearly also affecting the old world as well. Now, not every old world farm is good. Values for some really old standbys like Outland's Fell Iron Ore or Wrath's Winter Grasp are now a shadow of what they once were. But there's been plenty of new candidates emerging, especially from Battle for Azeroth. And thanks to my switching to those older content farms in recent weeks, I've still been able to maintain fairly consistent levels of 15,000 gold per hour or above. Ever since Shadowlands, I've generally set myself a goal of ending an expansion with at least 10 million more than I started, and I hit that goal over a month ago. If it had not been for those gold sinks, I'd have hit it far sooner, of course. In reality, I'm probably around 15 million gold ahead on the start of the expansion. And I think that hitting maybe 16 to 17 million ahead before the end is now a realistic goal. And of course, gold making is still far from done in the War Within, as this time around Blizzard have dropped a bit of a gold making curveball, albeit one that we did see coming. And that, of course, is player housing. In the run-up to the launch of player housing early access, there was a ton of attention on the new lumber mechanic and its ability to make gold. And for people who enjoy crafting, it has turned out to be very sweet indeed. A quick look on the auction house in the week after the housing launch, and something as simple as a shelf's worth of books could still set you back 11 to 12,000 gold to purchase. And my understanding is that despite the very high cost of crafted housing items, they have been flying off the shelves for crafters. And I've been seeing some people who normally struggle to make gold crashing through their first 1 million gold in just a matter of days. I did consider diving into that market, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm not really a fan of crafting. Had lumber been sellable in the auction house, I would have been all over it as a farm. But as it is not, it's not really super interesting to me. I did wonder if player housing might also affect the demand for other older content farms, and that does seem to be the case, as all of a sudden I found myself back up to making 17,500 gold per hour from older content farms in the last couple of days. But that's honestly a fairly modest jump. I'm not expecting this housing bump to last very long though. For many players, decorating will be a one-off thing, and even for people who like to tinker with their homes over the long term, once you do buy a shelf worth of book or whatever, if you remove that from your home, it just ends up going back into your storage to be reused in the future. So if you're currently making bank at housing crafting, I recommend you do go all in, as for sure it's not going to last. Now, there is another side of housing, of course. People do have to buy lots of decor items, and many of them are coming from vendors, which means it is turning into a pretty effective low-level gold sink. In fact, as more players are willing to spend on lower cost items, I would not be surprised if housing is currently sinking a lot more gold out of the game's economy than either the war bank or that crowd pummeler mount ever did. Now, if you're an old school crafter, you will probably remember the days of Shadowlands legendaries, or being able to make bank by listing convenient raid size stacks of consumables on your single realm auction house. And you probably look at dismay at a lot of the current approaches to gold making and the precipitous drop in prices for many of the old favourite standbys. But for those of us who adopted our approach to the new realities of the modern game, there have been plenty of new alternatives. And in the War Within, for sure, I think the big winners seem to have been the casual farmers like me. Taking into account the amount of gold I dropped in those gold sinks, which was the highest levels ever since BFA's Brutosaur, I am still expecting to end this expansion roughly 40 to 50% up on the War Within, which is a rather nice rate of inflation. The big question, of course, is this type of level going to carry forwards into Midnight? This is very hard to predict. In Midnight, mining and herbing will go from having 3 ranks of mats down to just having 2, and that will probably mean a lot more supply of the highest rank mat. But at the same time, bearing in mind that rank 1 and rank 2 mats currently tend to end up costing about the same price, there is going to be some lower supply for lower level mats as well. Much I think is going to depend on how Blizzard balances between rank 1 and rank 2 drops as we level up, but also how the wider changes to crafting is going to affect demand for those lower level materials. If I'm right about botters having a harder time, at least for now, there is no sign of them finding a way to make a comeback. Now, I do think it is probably inevitable that they eventually will. Botting versus Blizzard is an arms race after all. But if this lull in botting can persist, at least for the start of the new expansion, I do think that there's still a decent likelihood that we can expect to see Midnight start with a similar pattern to the War Within, with historically high gold per hour rates, and those being maintained for at least the first half of the first season. It is beyond that point where things start to become really uncertain. It is as we rank our professions up that the impact of reducing the number of material ranks will become evident, and I cannot help but feel that in the botting front, the clock is simply ticking until they figure out a way to make that comeback that I'm sure they desperately want to do. But nevertheless, if you want to get into gold making and perhaps hit your first 10 million gold in the Midnight expansion, I do think that the start of the expansion will be the best time to start your push. I'd be super interested to hear all of your experiences with the War Within's economy. Have you been making bank? Tell us how and how much. Or have you been struggling to adapt to the many changes in the game? If you found this update helpful, entertaining, or even just plain annoying, then let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with my other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. If you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me in social media for updates. My link's in the description below as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.